The president's chief of staff and the president's attorney general worked for one of the biggest lobbying firms that's received hundreds of thousands.
Okay, this next one is a little different, and honestly, it caught my attention for a reason. Because what you're about to hear isn't coming from an activist, or a whistleblower on the outside, or some anonymous source. It's coming from a sitting member of Congress speaking openly on the House floor. So, Representative Thomas Massie from Kentucky goes up and essentially tells the country that all three branches of government are being influenced by lobbyists tied to a major German chemical company. And at the same time, he says there's a coordinated effort to withhold information in the Epstein investigation, specifically information that could implicate powerful people. Now, here's the part that makes people sit up a little straighter. He's not just throwing accusations into the air. He's saying this with documentation, with receipts, with enough confidence that he's willing to put names on the record in Congress, knowing full well it's all being archived. You can call it drain the swamp if you want, but apparently the swamp now comes with corporate branding and maybe a sponsorship deal. But before we watch the clip, there's some really important context you need. Massie isn't some random lawmaker commenting from the sidelines. He actually helped write and push the Epstein Files Transparency Act. That bill passed almost unanimously, 427-1, and it was signed into law back in November. The purpose was simple. The Department of Justice was supposed to release Epstein-related files without redacting names, just to spare powerful or well-connected people from embarrassment. So what you're about to see is the author of that law standing on the House floor and saying his own administration is now violating it. And he doesn't stop there. In the same speech, he links that alleged cover-up to an entirely separate controversy involving a foreign corporation and the two highest law enforcement officials in the country. He doesn't hint. He doesn't dance around it. He names names. So yeah, take a second, watch this clip carefully. And when we come back, I'll walk through what's being claimed, what's actually verifiable, and why this moment matters a lot more than it might seem at first glance.
Congress funds the Department of Justice, and Congress is responsible for the oversight of the Department of Justice. When will we see justice? I'll tell you what I've not seen. I've not seen any arrests from the revelations in the Epstein files, over 3 million documents describing horrible things, describing unspeakable things, so much of it redacted. Over 24 people have resigned, CEOs, members of government worldwide, but I haven't seen any arrests or investigations here in the United States from this Department of Justice. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, who has since been stripped of his royal titles due to his affiliation with Jeffrey Epstein, has been arrested. Peter Mandelson, who previously served as UK's ambassador to the United States, resigned in disgrace from United Kingdom's House of Lords and the Labour Party, and he's been arrested. Former Prime Minister of Norway, Torbjørn Jagland, has been charged. But we don't see any charges, arrests, or investigations in the United States. What do we see? We see our FBI director celebrating in the locker room at the Olympics overseas. It's fine to be proud of this country, but we should be proud of this country because we have a system of justice that works, and yet we do not. Who are the men that should be investigated? I'll name them right here. Leon Black. You don't even have to see past the redactions to see that this man needs to be investigated. Jess Staley, accused of terrible things. It's right there in the files. Why is he not being investigated? And Leslie Wexner. Why did the FBI list him as a co-conspirator in their own documents in a child sex trafficking case and then tell him, according to him, that they had no questions for him? Why is that? Well, the Epstein Files Transparency Act requires the DOJ and the FBI to disclose to us their internal memos and emails about how they made those decisions, whether to prosecute or not prosecute. Yet they have not delivered those memos. And we still don't have the memos and documents and emails from 2008 to explain why Jeffrey Epstein was given such a light sentence in what would have been an open and shut case of child sex trafficking, which allowed him to go back and recommit these terrible crimes, create hundreds of more victims, and ensnare so many other people in his conspiracy. Where are those documents that describe those decisions? We need justice. We want the Department of Justice to get to work, and that's what they need to do now. Madam Speaker, I rise today to let the American people know that this government is under siege. All three branches of this government is under siege by lobbyists and lawyers from a German company named Bayer. They spent over $9 million lobbying the executive branch and the legislative branch so that they don't have to be liable for any damages that their herbicide causes, otherwise known as Roundup. And they're having some success. Now, they haven't had any success yet in this chamber to get that immunity. They've had some success in the state legislatures, which are also under siege, to get this immunity from liability. Look, the Constitution guarantees people a trial if they've been harmed. Why are we contemplating going against the Constitution? The Attorney General has opined favorably for this German company in front of the Supreme Court about getting rid of any liability that they should have for any damages. And the most recent thing that we've seen, the executive branch. By the way, the President's Chief of Staff and the President's Attorney General worked for one of the biggest lobbying firms that's received hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars from Bayer. And maybe that's why we've seen an executive order that says that the production of this chemical from this German company is a national defense priority. And we know why they're doing that. It's to keep them from having any liability. Everybody in this country deserves their day in court. This is wrong. We shouldn't succumb to the lobbyists, not in the executive branch, not in the judicial branch, and certainly not here in Congress, and not in the state legislatures. But there's a lot of money at play. And I implore my colleagues to resist it and do not give them immunity. And I yield back.
If you're sitting there thinking, wait, that can't possibly all be true, I get it. That was my first reaction too. Because what Representative Thomas Massie laid out on the House floor sounds less like normal politics and more like something that shouldn't be able to exist in the same sentence. But the uncomfortable part is this. Once you slow it down and check the pieces, it's not exaggerated. If anything, it's understated. Let's start with the Epstein Files, because that's the foundation of everything else. The law Massie keeps referencing wasn't some fringe proposal. It passed the House 427-1. That's not a squeaker. That's near total agreement in a body that can't agree on the time of day. And the principle behind it was simple. The Department of Justice is not allowed to redact information just to spare powerful people embarrassment or political damage. Accountability was the point. Massie didn't write that law alone. He worked with a Democrat. It passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, and it was signed into law by the president. So this isn't a partisan fight about whether the rule should exist. The rule exists. The question is whether it's being followed. According to Massie and his co-author, when they were finally allowed into a DOJ reading room to review what were supposed to be unredacted materials, they immediately found names that were still hidden. Not one or two questionable cases, multiple, in a matter of hours, and that's with millions of pages still unseen. That alone raises a serious red flag, regardless of where you fall politically. Now, when Massie tried to raise this with Pam Bondi, the response wasn't clarification or explanation, it was dismissal, personal attacks. That's notable because attacking the messenger is usually what happens when the substance is harder to defend. But here's where this story stops being just about Epstein Files and starts becoming something much bigger. Massie didn't just accuse the DOJ of ignoring a transparency law, he connected that behavior to lobbying influence, specifically influence tied to Bayer, the corporation behind Roundup. Public lobbying disclosures show Bayer spending millions to influence Congress and the executive branch. That part isn't speculation, it's documented. What makes it uncomfortable is the overlap. The same lobbying firm that represented Bayer also previously employed two of the most powerful figures in the executive branch. Again, that's not a theory. That's a matter of public record. You can decide for yourself whether that's a conflict, coincidence, or something in between. But pretending it's nothing at all requires ignoring how influence actually works in Washington. Then comes the executive order. The administration used a national defense authority to prioritize domestic production of glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup. That's unprecedented. No prior administration has labeled a farm chemical as a national security priority in that way, and it happened while Bayer is fighting tens of thousands of lawsuits from people who say the product made them seriously ill. At the same time, the administration is supporting legal arguments that could wipe out those lawsuits entirely if the Supreme Court rules in Bayer's favor. If that happens, it wouldn't just affect this one company. It would set a precedent that shields corporations from liability as long as a federal agency approved their label, even if harm was hidden, even if warnings were inadequate. That's not a technical legal tweak. That's a fundamental shift in accountability. So when you zoom out, you're not looking at isolated controversies. You're looking at a pattern. A transparency law passed overwhelmingly, then ignored. Files meant to be public, still hidden. A corporation facing massive liability suddenly treated as strategically essential, and all of it intersecting through the same influence channels. What makes this moment so striking is who is saying it out loud. Massie isn't an outsider. He's not a Democrat. He's not running an opposition campaign. He's a Republican congressman standing on the House floor saying the system is failing its own rules. And that tells you something important. This isn't about left versus right. This is about whether power still answers to the law or whether the law quietly steps aside when power is expensive enough. The most troubling part isn't even the allegations themselves. It's the fact that a member of Congress now feels the only way to force transparency is to threaten to read names into the congressional record because that's one of the last places protected from retaliation. That shouldn't be a last resort in a functioning democracy. It should be unnecessary. If the promise of American law still means anything, it has to apply upward, not just downward. And right now, the message being sent is that accountability has a price tag, and if you can afford it, the rules get a lot softer. That's not draining the swamp, that's monetizing it. And if you found this breakdown useful, if you care about understanding what's actually happening beneath the headlines, make sure you're subscribed. It helps support independent commentary, and it keeps these conversations going. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you in the next one.